By now, you're probably aware of the link between J.K. Rowling and transphobia, right? But if you're anything like me, you might not have fully understood why that link was there in the first place. I mean, I've seen a few tweets that were weird, but nothing that seemed to necessitate the strong reaction that I saw on Twitter and TikTok. But then again, it is Twitter and TikTok, which are two platforms entirely based on overly strong reactions to nothing, and truth is typically optional. So am I saying that applies here? Well, considering J.K. Rowling's most recent novel is a 1,000-page self-insert piece about a woman who is hunted down after being accused of transphobia, you tell me. Before we get into the calls to action to protest Harry Potter from people who have no idea how to protest, and before we get into how to actually hit Rowling where it hurts, let's get into why all of this is even being discussed in the first place. First, it's worth noting that Rowling has received a fair bit of criticism and, to an extent, praise for trying to make the Harry Potter series more retroactively progressive. Also, she felt the need to make it canon that before Hogwarts had bathrooms, wizards would just take a shit on the floor wherever they were standing and use the vanishing charm to clean up after themselves. First of all, I didn't realize that first-year students, including Muggleborns who have never casted a spell before, can make matter disappear on day one, unless you're telling me for them taking a shit was a two-person affair. Second of all, why? Third of all, the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets was fully integrated into a bathroom by a founder of Hogwarts, meaning they had bathrooms from day one. Okay, sorry, I'm getting off topic. It's just, wizard shit is such a huge trigger for me these days. No, but you know what? They also could have just had toilets that instead of plumbing, they used the vanishing charm. Like, there were so many options. I'm letting it go. I'm sorry, letting it go. My bad. But all of this mounted Rowling as a figure for the progressive movement to get behind, right? So what happened? See, in discussions about how transgender people fit into feminism, a subsection of feminists called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, were identified. And as a result of some of her weird statements on trans issues, that term has been widely applied to Rowling. You see, an idea that's recently gained traction is that sex and gender are two separate concepts. Basically, sex is what you're born having below the belt, and gender is what you grow to be up here. Now, a common way to diminish the existence of trans people is not just to refuse to acknowledge that this idea exists, but also to pretend that it's an overly confusing idea that you couldn't possibly wrap your head around, much like the sky turning black. Except, it's remarkably simple. But if you want to feel smarter, just know that as we speak, there is someone in the comments using he to refer to a person who goes by Jimmy to say that using pronouns and preferred names are concepts beyond mere men. But a lot of Rowling's controversy came about due to this very idea of not distinguishing between gender and sex. Perhaps the biggest example of this was Rowling's commentary on Maya Forstater. In essence, Rowling expressed support for Forstater's belief that trans women are just that. You can use their preferred pronouns and be perfectly respectful, but to refer to them as women is false. They're just pretending. In fact, Forstater went so far as to call the idea of widely acknowledging trans women as being women dogma and totalitarian. Now, in case the specifics of why that's problematic isn't quite clear, here's the best analogy I can think of as a cisgendered person who can in no way represent the trans community. When a toddler says that they're an astronaut and you play along, you're humoring them because ultimately it makes them feel good when you play into their fantasy, right? But you're not going to reinforce to your friends that your toddler is an astronaut, nor do you really see them as an astronaut, right? So with what Rowling is saying, essentially you should be humoring fully grown adults in the same way that you would a toddler. That's not right. Calling a trans woman she, her means nothing if you're going to just run to Twitter and say that they're only pretending. You're still going out of your way to make sure they feel excluded, you're just waiting until you can hide behind a screen to do it. How very brave. In response to Forstater receiving backlash and ultimately not having her professional contract renewed, Rowling was perhaps her most vocal supporter. And rather than state that she doesn't believe in the separation of gender and sex, she just pretends to have never heard of that concept. For example, Rowling has said, if sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. One, J.K. Rowling's argument implies that straight cis men would be attracted to trans men since their biological sex would technically be female. But I wouldn't personally consent to something like that because I don't sleep with men, right? Insert the fully original, but I kissed the homies goodnight joke here. Sorry guys, I have to try to appeal to Gen Z, and recycling unfunny jokes for the sake of relatability is the state of online comedy these days, you understand. 2, transgender people do face gender-based issues. It's not really problematic to say that unless a trans person goes out of their way to say that they understand that experience better than people who have lived their entire lives as that gender. And I don't really think anyone would do that because a trans person is far more likely to be discriminated against as a trans person than as a man or woman. So why is it necessary for J.K. Rowling to go out of her way to exclude trans people in order to correct something that they didn't even say? And that idea of like, was this really necessary, even extends to her most recent novel. You see, Rowling just released a novel that is a 1,000-page story about a content creator who faces bullying online and accusations of being transphobic. This ultimately leads to someone breaking her ongoing record of breaths taken. And one of the reasons that this novel is so controversial is like, 1,000 pages is a lot, dude. Like, we can mostly agree that cancel culture in its current form is not a good thing. But that is the one thing that J.K. Rowling most feels the need to comment on out of everything going on in the world. Remember, Rowling wrote a 7-novel series about every facet of no longer living, yet now she's writing about this. That's not a little weird? Also, her pen name for this novel is Robert Galbraith, which is also the name of a prominent 20th century psychiatrist who extensively studied how to quote-unquote cure gay people. Now, she claims this is a coincidence, but 1, hell of a coincidence all things considered, and 2, who doesn't Google a pseudonym before they take it? Like, it's really hard to claim ignorance when Google is free. And as these controversies build, more and more people have taken to critically analyzing the Harry Potter series and have made the argument that it isn't as progressive as once thought. The most important example for the purposes of this video is the fact that the Wizarding World's bank and by extension economy are run by goblins, which some have claimed are a Jewish caricature. I'm not saying that I think every retroactive critique is accurate. I do think a fair number of them are a reach, but I'm not going to bother going into which ones, you know? Why? Because, okay, apparently, when I don't have enough experience in a certain issue, I can just keep my opinions to myself, right? And the same applies for when I don't have the time to give a topic the nuance it needs, right? Like, white people, apparently, we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to just say nothing once in a while. Someone should probably go tell Rowling, right? So that's where we are now. But let's state the obvious. Is liking Harry Potter transphobic? No, obviously not. But what about supporting it? Well, a large part of the trans community have expressed that they would best feel supported if people started to take steps to ensure that less money was going into Rowling's pockets. But a small yet very vocal portion of the conversation surrounding this topic seemed to be, in my opinion, unproductive, especially when discussing the upcoming video game set in the Wizarding World. So I'd like to discuss some of the ways that I think the discourse around this topic can be more productive. Of course, not as some outsider who thinks they know what's best for the trans community, because obviously I don't, but rather from the perspective of being the very person that these people are trying to convince. Next year, a new game set in the Wizarding World is scheduled to be released for players everywhere. Let's rephrase that. Next year, the game that millions of people have been waiting for decades is finally being released. See, when the original movies were produced, a series of games were released alongside them. And while the games had an inconsistent reception, the games that were received particularly well all had one thing in common. Hogwarts was laid out with player exploration in mind, normally with some level of open world design, because that's what people were clamoring for. A game set in Hogwarts that allowed the player freedom to explore it at their leisure, preferably with an original story and role-playing mechanics. I mean, playing as Harry Potter is great, but not when you're doing it 10 times for a story that has no chance of surprising you, right? Simply put, this is something that people have been waiting for their whole lives, but does that make it okay to buy? Now, the most prominent example of this title's controversy is the fact that despite Rowling's lack of involvement with it, she is a rights holder of the larger franchise, meaning, yes, she will likely make a profit in direct correlation to how this game performs. Given her impact on the trans community, many understandably do not wish to see this game succeed. Even further, some have made the argument that the game itself is anti-Semitic. If you remember, the goblin species in Harry Potter has been debated as intending to negatively represent the Jewish population, and the game's story is about the goblin race wanting to liberate themselves from wizard rule. In order to do this, the goblins align themselves with an insert for the people of our world who are not seeing Jewish people as deserving to live. So on top of transphobia, you now have people stating that this game is anti-Semitic, which is furthering the calls to protest it, which is great. Mostly. The problem that I'm observing with these calls to action is the combination of not understanding how protesting a game actually works, combined with reducing how meaningful this franchise and upcoming game are to millions of people. And in order to ensure that this video has some value and is hopefully a net positive for the trans community in some way, towards the end I'm going to give some suggestions on how to actually effectively protest this game, coming from someone who knows this industry better than really almost anyone not actively working in it. And the argument that I'm responding to basically boils down to, who cares? It's just a game. You don't need to play it, so don't. That is the bare minimum you can do. And while we're at it, the game itself is anti-Semitic, so why would you even want to play it? Kind of weird of you if I'm being honest. So here's why that's not helpful. As a cisgendered person who loved Harry Potter growing up and loves video games as well. One, the when all else fails, go for a personal attack approach by calling the person anti-Semitic isn't doing what you think. And not everyone agrees that the portrayal of goblins in Harry Potter is problematic. So when you state that they're anti-Semitic based on an interpretation they don't agree with, in my opinion, it just makes it look like you're floundering when the original point of not wanting to support Rowling is a strong enough one. Second, there are multiple ways to play this game while reducing or completely eliminating Rowling's profit. More on that shortly. Third, that mindset of, oh, it's just a game is more likely just going to get you ignored, as that's actually a pretty combative topic for video game enthusiasts. Briefly put, gaming has always been in this weird place in media. It's the only medium where people debate its status as an art form, despite it combining various forms of art. People are looked down on for playing for, say, an hour a day by the same people who waste hours on social media. And also, it has been the thing that those in power is blamed for violence for decades now, despite that claim being repeatedly disproven. So on the surface, to a video game consumer who is not aware of the complexities of the situation, if you buy this game, you're transphobic, sounds a lot like the same video games cause violence nonsense that they've been ignoring for decades. Also, by positioning it as just a game, or by saying protesting it is the bare minimum, you're literally asking someone to sacrifice a piece of media that they've possibly been dying for decades, while denying that it even is a sacrifice in the first place. So yes, what I'm saying here is the most oppressed class of citizen truly is gamers. No, that's not what I'm saying. And if you're still going to apply the logic of you are literally exchanging a game for the safety of the trans community, fine, that's fair. Let's make sure we apply that to everything then. For your convenience, I actually made a list of just a few of the media and services that you have to give up on in order to be an ethical consumer, since it's so easy. And since people are really dense, let's just be clear, what I'm about to say is satirical. And I don't mean satirical like when people on TikTok just use it in order to defend the offensive things they say completely seriously. I mean like this is the definition of satire. If you purchase anything from Amazon, you support the exploitation of labor and union busting, not to mention the increase of police authority and abuse. By the way, that includes its various subsidiaries such as Whole Foods, Ring, and Audible. In fact, any content creator who has accepted an Audible sponsorship is contributing to this problem, so better to protest all of those as well. And minus the police thing, all of that also goes for Walmart too, by the way. Now, using Meta's services, such as Facebook, Instagram, or Oculus, means you're directly contributing to the undermining of Western democracy, media misinformation, and increased surveillance of private citizens. Listening to Chris Brown or Kanye means you're enabling domestic abusers. In fact, that would include any service that platforms them, right? Including Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or your local radio stations. Chick-fil-A, Five Nights at Freddy's, and the SMT Persona series all harm the LGBTQ+ community in some way, so adjust your consumption accordingly. YouTube exploits the addictive nature of the dopamine rush one feels while consuming content in order to sell ads. This includes an entire section of their website dedicated to children, by the way. Not to mention, consuming gaming in any fashion is supporting an industry that exploits developers until they reach their breaking point, not to mention the treatment of women who participate in the industry to any capacity, and the reliance on player addiction to make a profit. Also, Harvey Weinstein movies. Do I even need to say it? Don't worry, it's super easy to avoid his 330 movies. Here are just a few examples to get started. Lastly, no paying taxes in states like Florida, Texas, or Kentucky, so you're gonna have to uproot your whole life in order to be ethical. What? It's just one move? Now, the point of that bit wasn't to throw a fit. Rather, it was to demonstrate that ethical consumption as a whole is a really difficult thing to abide by. And it's really patronizing for me to see people with no interest in the series or medium just reduce it in the ways that I said. Because ultimately, why is this different than every other example? Why is this the time where if someone doesn't consume something ethically, they're a bad person or a child? Why is that language not used for anything else? This is incredibly important, but why is this when it's okay to go for personal attacks on people? And if you're going to say that some of the examples that I gave are a false equivalence or just a bad example, fine, absolutely. I agree with you, I'll do better in the future. What about the rest? The fact that you're watching this video right now means you're not being as ethical of a consumer as you could be. And I already feel the incoming straw man of, are you saying this game is more important than the trans community? Absolutely not. So here are 5 ways to actually effectively protest this game in ways people will actually do, instead of just buying the game and not mentioning it online, which is all Twitter and TikTok are going to cause at this point. First, buy the game used. Why? In most retailers, when they sell a new product, a portion of the proceeds have to go to the developers and publishers and, by extension, Rowling. However, with used titles, the retailer typically keeps all proceeds of that transaction. I mean, why do you think GameStop pushes used games so hard? It also hurts the sales numbers, which hurts the developers when it's time for them to face investors. eBay and Facebook Marketplace also work for this, by the way. Second option, maybe you can't play physical games or you just don't want to buy a used game. Yo ho ho and a bottle of rum. I can't say more without legal issues, but you get it, right? Third, borrow the game from a friend. Pretty obvious why that one works. Fourth, if none of that is an option, maybe you have a digital-only console, then buy the game when it's on sale. A lower cost means less money going where you don't want it. But Jimmy, I don't want any money going towards Rowling. Yeah, okay, valid. But would you rather people spend $70 on this game or $30? No one's going to refrain from buying this game just because you said so find ways to make your protest more effective by providing more options for people to meaningfully contribute to it. Fifth, try to discourage content creators from providing this game with free promotion. This one won't work, but you never know. And look at that, 5 more effective ways to protest this game than refusing to sympathize with people while demanding their sympathy and sprinkling in personal attacks when that doesn't work. And again, this criticism is not at all towards the larger transgender community. It is literally towards this small vocal minority that is just making the situation worse, in my opinion. Activism is so important, but we live in the age of instant gratification, right? So I feel like young people, that doesn't make me sound ancient, but whatever. I feel like they have this unfortunate habit of latching on to the best case scenario and assuming that anyone who doesn't fully get on board is an enemy, so they end up throwing away the smaller victories and ultimately lose, right? Good intentions only go so far when they're not followed by positive change. I actually talked about a similar idea as it relates to body positivity, so feel free to check it out if you want, but I'd appreciate if you could leave a like first. And just a heads up, whenever I say in a video that transgender people should be treated as, well, people, that always brings out weird transphobes looking for a fight, so if you do decide to brave into the comments, just make sure you go prepared.